So we'll be discussing both the traditional methods and in the next subsection, the more novel methods of doing descriptive analysis. For traditional, we'll cover these six which are presented here. Generally, these could have as little as 4 panelists, but normally around 8 to 12 yung pinaka-optimal. Anything larger than that, like 16 or 20, would be hard to handle because it's almost as big as a classroom. So the flavor profile is one of the oldest, and it was developed by Arthur Little around the 1940s. It's a consensus technique, meaning the panelists should agree on what the score should be, but the consensus is arrived upon after tasting and retasting. Vocabulary used to describe the product and the product evaluation are achieved by reaching an agreement among the panel members. So given this, mostly parang round table type yung gamit nilang setup. And generally, this is concentrated on the flavor, both the overall and the individual flavor components of a system. So yung flavor profile na naka-focus siya obviously sa flavor, okay? So yung ibang sensory attributes medyo minimal lang dito or hindi talaga siya yung concern. Although you could modify this method to include a profile for the other attributes such as appearance, aroma, or texture. So there's the overall flavor description, like when you see a spider plot na yung lahat ng um, intensities na nakasummarize doon. And there's the individual flavor notes including aftertaste and amplitude. So, yung tabulation of perceived flavors, one by one, makikita mo doon yung mga na-identify mo na flavor and gaano kalakas yung intensity nila. Aftertaste is measured around 1 minute after swallowing, kind of like when you eat something. And yung hininga mo afterwards, kapag hinihinga mo sa loob or pag napaburp ka, amoy pa rin yung pagkain. Amplitude, it's a bit hard to explain this one. It's the overall impression of balance of blending. So I'll just give examples. So heavy cream, for example, when it is been whipped, has low amplitude. But when you add sugar, it has higher amplitude. And when you add vanilla essence on top of that, it has a higher amplitude still. So, for example, if you like tea, tea in itself has low amplitude. Adding milk increases the amplitude, and adding pearls increases the amplitude even more. So, parang kapag ano siya, mas pleasant kainin, hindi siya yung overbearingly lopsided yung lasa, yung nakakaasuya, then that would have an increase in amplitude. So as a concept, it's very arbitrary, but once you taste something, you get the point. You can easily tell if this food has a high or low amplitude, and generally, higher amplitude foods would likely be more acceptable to maybe the general consuming public. So originally, the flavor profile used ratings of 0 to 3 with a threshold or the just recognizable option. However, this has been expanded to have half steps or yung mga plus minus, okay? So generally, it is of course at least ordinal in its rating, and hopefully with enough training and very good vocabulary set, it might even be treated as interval, no? But definitely not ratio data. So in the tabulation profile, the order in which the flavor notes are perceived are indicated. So may parang chronology siya. And just to be clear, the consensus is made not by an averaging process, but by discussion and re-evaluation with the panelists and the panel leader. Although maari nating sabihin na uh, on paper, hindi siya in-average dun sa discussion, pero in their minds, they would just average it out or something like that. In class, usually when we do this consensus method, usually, ang nangyayari, siyempre, yung medyo majority, kino-convince nila yung mga outlier na, hindi, ito talaga yung score niya. tapos sige na lang. Okay. So here's an example of the results for consensus for the composite flavor profile of turkey patties with 0.4% phosphate. So take note, no, those are descriptors for flavor na serumy, metallic, poultry, brothy. So tapos may mga lag and pause pa. So parang na-identify nila um, these are the first three kapag dumampi sa dila mo, and then after a while merong iba kang mararamdaman hanggang sa ma-feel mo yung huli, which is organ meat. And as you can see, merong mga plus minus yan. So parang nota ng piano, no? May sharps and flats, parang ganon. But this one, of course, each number has a plus or a minus, no? So something like 1, 1 plus, 2 minus, 2, 2 plus, ganon yung order. Okay? So, medyo weird siya. Kasi nga, syempre, luma na tong method na ito. One alternative is the profile attribute analysis. Medyo sa Tagalog, pangit yung acronym niya, PAA. So, it's a modern version of the flavor profile where you can use statistical analysis, basically treat it like a parametric test with at least interval information. But you can also transform it into a similar to flavor profile type na consensus description. So, ang maganda kasi na pag nag-consensus ka, iisa lang yung sagot mo. Hindi ka na mag-stat doon, di ba? Kasi nga, as one yung sagot nyo, walang deviation yun, di ba? Para kayong nag-mode, tapos iisa lang yung sagot ninyong lahat. Okay. Of course, you need still proper training of panelists and even the panel leader in both cases. So in class, I've tried being the panel leader for a number of years now sa mga students. And really, ang hirap niya, dapat objective ka. You control the flow of the discussion if it strays too far, but at the same time, you don't want to dominate the discussion since you want to evoke still from your panelists yung mga gusto nilang i-express na ideas. Another popular method is the QDA, or quantitative descriptive analysis, developed in the 1970s, supposed to be to correct some perceived problems with more popular flavor profile analysis at that time. In this case, the first one they address is that the data is not generated by consensus, which eliminates any errors related with, palakasan ng opinion. Okay. And panel leaders, in this case, are facilitators instead of being active participants in the discussion. So, mas limited, mas restricted yung ginagawa ng panel leader. In this case, we use unstructured line scales instead of the 0, -1, 1, +1, etc. And those line scales are used to describe the intensity of whatever attributes are being considered. So the procedures for QDA are as follows. You have 10 to 12 judges exposed to the product and its variations to facilitate the formation of concepts na familiarize lang sila dun sa product. And then the panelist generates a set of terms on their own to describe. So parang individually kinukuha mo na mag-work sila na gumawa ng kani-kanilang vocabulary and maybe try to define the things that they perceived from the exposure part. And then, ang mas consensus lang dito na part is in development ng vocabulary and references and sequence for evaluation. So dito sa part na to, it's an open roundtable discussion. However, it's not the actual data collection. It's just how you make the forms, identifying what needs to be measured, and the references that will go into measuring them. So just like in games, merong mga practice round dito, mga trial evaluation before you go to the actual being collected na data, okay? And the panel leader evaluates the judges based on these initial evaluations using statistical analysis. of their performance relative to the entire panel. I remember now, it's panel check software, yung freeware na binanggit ko dun sa previous video. Okay, you can try to search that and download it for yourself, but I doubt that you can use it effectively agad. Siyempre may learning curve yan, mga dedicated software yan eh. After you do the analysis of the judging ability of the panelists, you may proceed now to, you receive the samples, and you do your individual evaluation. And this time now, you will be isolated in booths para ma-minimize yung bias. So dun sa first part, it's a round table kasi nga habang tumitikim kayo, nag-discuss kayo, hindi, ito yung flavor note na yun. I think this is a better word to describe what you're trying to say. So on. Pero dito, since na-establish na yun, kanya-kanyang evaluation na using your scale. So in QDA, automatic na ang ginagamit is line scale, typically the 150 mm or approximately 6-inch scale with word anchors on both ends usually. And this could be analyzed using ANOVA and multivariate statistical techniques. Okay, normally we would consider the data to be interval in nature. Okay, and as with the previous descriptions, there are multiple replicates especially needed to check the consistency of the judges. So if you want to compare one panelist's performance, you look at his or her judgments across all of the replicates for the same sample. So one major difference with flavor profile is that QDA can be used to describe lahat ng sensory attributes niya, hindi lang basta flavor. Okay? And usually, mga radar plots yung ginagamit natin. And supposed to be faster QDA in terms of training requirements and time. So ito yung sample ng radar plot niya. This is for breads. Okay, you have 3 groups here, yung green, yung red, and yung blue. And you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 attributes being compared across the 3. So as you can see here, madaling makita, for example, for crust color, nandyan yung major difference among the 3. And that perhaps overall, mas makikita nyo na yung green, yung pinakamalaki yung difference doon sa kanilang tatlo, whereas the red and blue, halos mag-overlap sila under most attributes. Okay, this is bread infused with inulin fiber. So the blue is the control, red is with 6%, and green is with 10% inulin. So as you can see, the more inulin you put in, mas pronounced yung changes, especially dun sa texture sa crumb. Okay. So in the nutshell, here are the things you should remember about advantages. The panelists perform individual judgments. This is better in a way because you don't need to have a consensus, and makikita mo kung may palyado talaga, no? Kasi sa consensus, kung ang sumikat, ang tinanggap nyo is yung taong nagkamali, hindi mali talaga. Dito, malalaman nyo kung consistent nga ba yung kada isa or hindi. And then language development is relatively free from the influence of the panel leader. So wala yung bias na yun brought about by the fact na si panel leader na merong interest dun sa magkalalabasan ng project ay siya yung magdidikta ng mga bagay-bagay. So mas organic dun sa mga panelists mo yung kalalabasan ng language development according to kung ano yung napag-usapan nila. And you use consumer language descriptions rather than mga highfalutin stuff na mga siguro food tech lang or scientist lang yung makaintindi. Okay, sunod naman we have the texture profile created in the 1960s and devised using principles of engineering. So ito mas technical ng konti. And obviously, kung yung flavor profile ay sa flavor na nag-focus, ito naman po ay sa texture. So, food is very complex, lalo na yun sa texture, and ang daming characteristics yan because of the fat, the moisture, and the components niya, no? And ang hirap, paano mo ba i-unify yung mga terms mo para kahit anong food ay ma-describe mo gamit ang isang limited set of texture vocabulary. Lalo na in relation to mastication because as we know, minsan yun yung hinahanap mo sa isang pagkain eh. Yung chicharon na stale na, kahit same yung lasa niya, pag ninaya mo, parang malungkot, di ba? Kung kumakain ka ng ice cream, may certain expectation ka sa lambot niya. At the same time, hindi mo rin ine-expect na runny siya. Parang ganon. There's a texture expected of marshmallow and for crispy and crunchy food. So on. So one good thing with the texture profile is the use of standardized terminology. This means that you can technically compare apples to apples in that kahit magkaiba yung produkto mo, pero dahil pareho yung terminology, pag nag-compare ka ng data, mahahambing mo na malalaman mo pala na sample you're comparing two different fruits. Kapag dito yung magkaiba sila sa texture profile, ganun pala yun. Yun pala yung implication. So, characteristics are described by both physical and sensory aspects. And there's also an order of appearance na taken into consideration, along with the definition of terms. These are also decided by consensus. Also, in terms of using rating scales, may pagka-standardized din siya. So, here's an example of a texture profile hardness scale. Okay, so take note, meron na siyang numerical values and then ito na yung references mo, including the sample sizes. Kasi syempre, if the sample sizes are different, magkaiba yung textural attributes nun. Like if it's a brownie and you push it with your finger, kung iba yung dimensions niya, yung height, yung length or width niya, pag pinush mo yun, yung effect ng compression forces dun, iba yung outcome. Anyway, so even yung temperature at which it would be served and then yung composition, in this case, yung mga brands, di ko lang alam, 1986 pa to, kung buhay pa rin yung mga brands na yun, o hindi pa man sila nag-reformulate. That's one disadvantage, no? Kapag nagsara yung company na reference mo, or nag-reformulate sila, hindi naman sila obligado na sabihin sa'yo na, hey, nagbago kami ng formulation for this one, new and improved, pero in that case, ibig sabihin, hindi mo na siya pwede gamitin for your purpose. So here are examples of texture profile analysis. And in this case, although the definitions are mostly universal, more or less, pagdating naman dun sa references, in this case, imbis na gumamit siya ng numerical scale, it's just a low and high, no? So in this case, the definitions are comparable, but if you're gonna compare this to other studies, you have to take into account na yung based on the references, the scale values themselves will not be simply comparable. So in choosing anchors for texture profile, what's important is the full range of that specific parameter should be anchored by the product. Na yung product na yun, yung specific characteristic niya is a major component. So for example, ibig sabihin lang nito, if you are measuring hardness in the context of food, if you want a scale that can be used, gusto mong ilagay yung softest available food and yung hardest available food. Na kapag in-evaluate mo siya, ma-isolate mo yung texture parameter niya. And of course, in this case, in this particular cited study, there are stuff in between. Okay? And weird lang kasi ang dami niyang references in between. Ang problema dito, the more references you have, of course, the less likely na maging totoong interval yung scale mo. Kasi who decides that the difference between an olive and the frankfurter is 1? And the difference between hard candy and an almond is 3.5, diba? So, at the very least, ordinal ito. Although, technically, dahil may number siya, statistically treated siya as parametric data, which is a bit troublesome. So, in this case, if you're gonna use texture profile as a sensory evaluation tool or descriptive test, products must be subjected to a texture profile analysis machine. Siya yung magsasabi sa'yo kung base dun sa results ng instrumental texture profile analysis ay pasok ba yung product na ito dun sa mga references na gusto kong tingnan or yung mechanics ba niya kasi baka mamaya it behaves more like a fluid than a solid, then you can't use a texture profile made for a certain range of solid foods, di ba? Although technically yung texture profile analysis dinevelop siya para sana palitan yung texture analysis using humans, no? So mas madalas actually ngayon na ang texture profile analysis na lang yung ginagamit na pang proxy kasi you just have one equipment that you can use anytime versus having to convene 10 people na ititrain mo for how many months just to get your results. This one can give you results in minutes or hours. So quick crash course lang, although this will be discussed in your food physics, no? But for a texture profile analysis, meaning yung gumagamit ng machine, these are the standardized definitions. So these are mathematical force calculations that give you tell you how they arrive at the values for the parameters specified. So for example, hardness is the force required to compress a food between the molars and defined as a force necessary to attain given deformation. So in terms of the instrumental analysis, it's the peak force of the first compression cycle. Kumbaga, kapag may nilagay ka sa pagitan ng dalawang molars mo at unti-unti mo siyang kinagat, tataas yung measurable force na yon hanggang mag-fracture, mag-break, something happens to that thing in between your teeth, and then the force drops. Okay, the force required to continue operations. And so on. You can pause this and read all of those, or you can just wait for FS122 is mid-year. So this is a sample of your typical texture profile analysis plot. So nakita niyo dun sa previous slide, meron mga D's, letter D, letter A, and yung P. So there's the P or peak force. A is the area under the curve, and D are the various distances, no? So they calculate the various texture-related parameters based on these. Ito ay isang tinatawag na 2-byte compression. So if this is the time, yung dalawang pagnguya mo, okay, yun. 1, 2. And based on those 2 bytes, they calculate the various texture profile parameters such as springiness, hardness, and so on. So unlike other methods wherein yung scale mo pwedeng mag-apply lang siya dun sa food mo, like pang marshmallow lang, so hindi mo kailangan ng candy. Dito sa texture profile, the scale would encompass pretty much the whole range of solid or semi-solid food na kahit anong food yan, papasok siya somewhere within this scale because no food is known to be harder than hard candy or softer than cream cheese in that hypothetical regard. Although you should have the same frame of reference for all panelists at the same time, you need to say, itong mga references na to, of course, this is for hardness only, pero marami pang ibang forces that when you apply compression, marami ka pang ibang madedetect like springiness, chewiness, etc. So, kailangan ma-call out mo yun na kapag hardness yung tinitignan mo, pag ginaya mo tong mga references na to, yung hardness lang based on the definition, yung ina-assess mo. Kasi yung fracturability, springiness, gumminess ng bawat isa sa mga references na to, magkakaiba. Okay, so pag nasa utak mo na hardness ang tinetest mo, i-disregard mo sana as a panelist lahat ng ibang aspeto ng mga reference mo na pwedeng maka-affect dun sa perception mo ng hardness. So next we have the sensory spectrum developed in the 1970s by one of the other popular authors na sensory evaluation books. And this was developed by someone who was popular with was familiar with the flavor texture profile. So ang main difference nito is that there's no vocabulary na nanggagaling sa panelists, no? So predefined na more or less using a standardized lexicon yung terms na gagamitin. So at least in this case, mas madaling mag-compare kasi halimbawa, if dun sa gumamit ng texture profile for example, magkaiba ng definition ng hardness kahit papano yung dalawang analyst, yung dalawang test, mas mahirap i-compare yon. And that has been one of the major complaints dun sa mga texture profiling, no? So in this case, the language used to describe the product o yung terms mo is chosen prior to the evaluation and cannot be changed for that specific category. So, ayan, yung example ng mga descriptors or lexicon of terms. And for each descriptor, you have a standardized scale with multiple reference points as seen here. So definitely the scales are numerical in nature and always from 0 to 15. So since wala nang parang generation of terms, more of selection na lang, majority ng time ng panelists ay sa paggamit na lang ng scales na tutuon yung training nila. And the panel leader ay parang director, okay? And is also responsible for disclosing information regarding the product. Meanwhile, the judges should be exposed to a wide latitude of products under that category so that even if hindi yun yung samples na itetest nyo, may idea ka pa rin dun sa mga parameters and how those different descriptors appear on various similar products. So dito, dahil may lexicon ka na, medyo mas dadali yung buhay mo kasi nandyan na yung words. You don't need to think of the words to describe them. You just need to think of, well, what those words mean. Kailangan lang aware ka na pag sinabing fresh grass. Yan. Okay. Alam mo kung ano yan and bakit siya different from earth and bakit siya different from moss and so on. So yun na lang yung kailangan i-train ng panelists, yung pag-intindi dun sa meaning ng term, but not the fact that they have to come up with terms to start with. So typically you'd have 0 to 15 scales. They're considered absolute in the sense na meron kang 0 and 0 would be the absence of that flavor. Thus, in a certain sense, pwede mong sabihin na if properly done siya, this could be treated like ratio data, okay? Pero syempre, depende na lang yun na how you came up with, for example, how is brown edge cookies a 3 on the scale and sugar a 4 and Bordeaux cookies a 7. So, syempre, kapag medyo palpak yung interval man lang nung psychological distance ng mga yan, asa ka pang maging okay yung pagiging ratio data niya, di ba? But then again, that's one thing we at least have to know to be cautious of when doing our analysis. In the creation of scales, of course, dahil nga meron kang true zero, meron ka rin tinatawag nating equi-intensity across the scale such that if you have 5 on the sweetness scales, then that is of a similar intensity of 5 on the salty scales. Of course, yung amount ng percentage of solutions would differ kasi mas sugar, for example, is the least intense by weight ratio, no? Pag dinilute mo sa tubig. Alright. How do they choose reference points? It's chosen based on how they represent different intensities. So kaya kung makikita nyo dito, the sweet, for example, has a 2, 4, 7, 9, 12.5. Pagdating mo naman sa salty, meron kang 2, 5, 7, 8, 9.5, 15. Kasi parang hindi sila pare-pareho ng value sa reference dahil kung tinest mo, halimbawa, itong Ritz Cracker pang 4 lang talaga yung score niya, hindi ko siya ipipilit gawing 5 para lang mag-align dun sa salty kasi yung salty, 5 yung salted cracker. Kung hindi talaga, wag ipilit. Kaya hindi siya mukhang uniform. Yung references, iba-iba yung values nila. Of course, as you've seen, they're all rounded off to, let's say, the nearest 0.5, diba? So parang, paano kung yung actual intensity niya para maging interval man lang na data is 9.3 instead of 9.5? But then again, those are things we have to live with and just simply consider that yung limitations na yan may affect the extent na kaya maging accurate ng data. In a sense, lahat naman ng sensory evaluation, yung attempt mo na i-quantify sila, ay very limited. It will never be as accurate or precise as using equipment like a pH meter or an analytical balance, diba? So just have to take that into account and have to make sure our panelists are in the best shape when they're doing their test. So again, the best thing we can do to make this work is to make sure that our panelists are all attuned or are all similarly calibrated in the use of these skills. And of course, to do that, you do the actual testing in isolated booths that prevent the other forms of panelist distraction from affecting their judgment. On the other hand, in the 1980s, they developed an approach that's seemingly contradictory to the previous one, wherein it's called free choice profiling, simply because the panelists can make their own list of descriptive terms and they're allowed to evaluate the product on their own way. So anything goes. Even the scales they're using should be based on what they do or what they've come up with. And the only thing that's standardized is the conditions using even individual booths in the actual testing. So in this case, the one question you may have could be, paano nila i-test yan kung magkakaiba nga yung mga salita? Ano naman ang gagawin mo para mag-make sense doon sa data na parang hindi naman mako-compare talaga dahil sobrang qualitatively different ng approaches nila. So for that, we have what we consider as we use the GPA or the Generalized Procrustes Analysis to try and give us a consensus picture of the data in either a 2D or 3D space. So as a GPA is a multivariate analysis, it would be very complicated to discuss it now. Hindi rin naman tayo gagawa ng free choice profiling sa lab. So I leave it at that for now, but we'll see in the later lectures kung may oras pa para tignan yon. But we'll at least touch on some other multivariate analysis statistics probably. Nonetheless, the advantages of course is that dahil nga free for all yung method mo, walang masyadong training na kailangan, so mas mabilis siya. And in a way, dahil hinalaw mo yung panelists na gamitin yung mga bokabularyo nila, pwedeng may makita kang mga words na halimbawa wala sa ibang tao or kung nag-consensus kayo ay hindi nyo maiisip. No, alam pag i-describe ko halimbawa, merong mga words sa mga taste na ang hirap like yung salitang maanggo, okay? Which roughly translates to gamey, G-A-M-E-Y. So, yun, isa yun sa mga bagay na pang-describe sa milk, no? Lalo na yung mga raw milk or from non-cow's milk. Paano mo mapapalabas yun kung ibang method yung gamit mo? What if only one panelist knows about that word and how to use it? So, na-eliminate yun kung nag-consensus kayo sa definitions or wala yun sa lexicon ni Civil. Disadvantage obviously would be a harder interpretation because of the individual flavor notes. Kahit ano pang galing ng stat software mo, paano mo i-fit into the picture yung ganong klaseng terms na ano ba talaga meaning na maanggo? Kasi ang ginagawa lang naman ng computer dyan is hindi naman niya ita-try i-define yung terms pero pwede niyang i-correlate yung responses ng mga tao na kung mataas um, yung rating ng component A sa sample A kay person A, tapos kay person B ganun din, if they use different words, then the computer might assume those different words have similar or parallel meanings or something like that. Okay? It's also what we call the generic descriptive analysis. So yung exercise niya sa lab is patterned after this one more or less. And it uses a combination of the QDA and sensory spectrum methods. So there's a training and evaluation phase where you use the mean and standard deviation for the panelists. And in the evaluation of samples, you use analysis of variance. One for attributes across all samples and another for the panelists. So, para makita mo dito yung difference between samples and difference between panelist responses. Again, this is another example from Dr. Villarino and Dr. Lizada, where then they first describe VCO and RBD coconut oil using descriptive analysis. And of course, ito yung lalabasan. So you have your samples here. So this is reduced bleached deodorized coconut oil, and these are the other samples. Okay, so you could see here na merong a mean plus minus standard deviation, and then yung significance groupings, yung superscripts, wherein if two samples have the same superscripts, then they are similar, whereas if they have a different superscript, they are significantly different at p of less than 0.05. So this is an example naman ng results ng isang principal component analysis. Okay, it's a multivariate analysis approach. Kasi for example, yung ANOVA, kaya lang niyang tingnan isang attribute turbidity, isang ANOVA for turbidity, isa for color, isa for flavor, but this one gives us a fuller picture. However, since most multivariate analysis are hard to explain, no? So hindi na natin yan masyadong titingnan dito. Ang alam lang natin is that the axes are principal components, and yung percentages tell us how much components along those axes account for the differences among the samples. Okay, so we'll try to look at it in much more detail later if we go through multivariate analysis either in this subject or on your succeeding subject.